Basho continuation of introduction. Part 5. The tragic sense is given beautiful expression in the opening passage of the Records of a Weather-Exposed Skeleton. Viewed as a whole, however, this work is not a complete success, because there is still too much self first. Too much self forced upon it, because now and then crude personal emotions hinder the reader from entering into the world of its poetry. It is written in habun, prose mixed with haiku. That's what we have, prose with haiku, poems with the travel sketch. But the two are not perfectly amalgamated. Sometimes prose is a mere explanatory note for haiku. And sometimes haiku stands isolated from prose, particularly towards the end of the work. The prose seems to be almost forgotten. In spite of these defects, however, the work is amply rewarding to those who read it with care, because it is the work of a man who tries to cast his own self away and almost achieves it. Because here and there in the work we find beautiful poems and prose passages where the author seems to have found, for a brief moment, his true identity. Indeed, the Records of a Weather-Exposed Skeleton is the first work of Basho where we find glimpses of his mature style. Basho returned to his home in Edo in the summer of 1685 after about 9 months of wandering. In 1684, while he was still in Nagoya, however, an anthology of great importance was published. It was called Fuyu no Hi, A Winter Day. It constitutes the first of the so-called 7 major anthologies of Basho, being Basho, Shikibu, Shu. If one compares the linked verses of this anthology with the linked verse quoted above, Basho wrote back in 1676 under the influence of Soan. One realizes the great spiritual distance he had traveled in less than a decade. With a bit of poem with a bit of madness in me, which is poetry, I plod along like Kikuse among the wails of the wind. Who is it that runs with hurried steps, flowers of Sasanquia dancing on his hat? Under the pale sky of dawn, I opportuned a water official to pose as a tavern keeper. A customer having arrived, his red horse stands shaking his head moist with dew. About the special features of Basho's linking techniques, I still have more to say later. Note here, however, the sweet eloquence with which the whole poem moves. The influence of Soyan is still faintly detectable, but ingenuity has given place to something at once deeper and quieter, something which is probably best described as human wisdom. In 1686, two anthologies, Kawazu Awase Frog Contest and Haru no Hai, A Spring Day, were published. The former is a collection of poems on frogs by Basho and his disciples. The latter is traditionally counted as the second of the major anthologies, though there are only 3 poems of Basho in it. The importance of these anthologies rests on a single poem by Basho included in them, which is probably the best known of all his poems. It has already been past the beginning of the introduction. Let me quote it here again. Once again with a comment by one of his disciples. Breaking the silence of an ancient pond, a frog jumped into water, a deep resonance. This poem was written by our master on a spring day. He was sitting in his riverside house in Edo, bending his ears to the soft cooing of a pigeon in the quiet rain. There was a mild wind in the air, and 1 of 2 petals of cherry blossom were falling gently to the ground. It was the kind of day you often have in late March, so perfect that you want it to last forever. Now and then in the garden was heard the sound of frogs jumping in the water. Our master was deeply immersed in meditation. Finally he came out with the second half of the poem. A frog jumped into water, a deep resonance. One of the disciples sitting with him immediately suggested for the first of the poem, Amidst the Flowers of the Yellow Rose. Our master thought for a while, but finally he decided on Breaking the Silence of an Ancient Pond. The disciple's suggestion is admittedly picturesque and beautiful, but our master's choice, being simpler, contains more truth in it. It is only he who has dug deep into the mastery of the universe who can choose a phrase like this. So many people in the past have commented upon this poem that it seems to me that its poetic resources have been well nigh exhausted. Still, it is possible, I believe, to use this poem as an illustration of Basho's mature style. What is remarkable in this poem is, in my opinion, the symbolism which it achieves without pretending in the least to be symbolic. On the surface of the poem describes an action of the frog and its after effects, a perfect example of objectivity. But if you meditate long enough upon the poem, you will discover that the action thus described is not merely an external one, that it also exists internally, and that the pond is indeed a mirror held up to reflect the author's mind. Basho explains this himself in the following way. Quote, "Go to the pine if you want to learn about the pine, or to the bamboo if you want to learn about the bamboo. And in doing so, you must leave your objective occupation with yourself. Otherwise, you impose yourself on the object and do not learn. Your poetry issues of its own accord when you and the object have become one. When you have plunged deep enough into the object to see something like a hidden glimmering there, however well phrased your poetry may be, If your feeling is not natural, if the object and yourself are separate, then your poetry is not true poetry, but merely your subjective counterfeit. Some people have spoken as if Basho entered into the realization of this principle the very moment he wrote The Frog Pond. It is difficult to believe that it was so. On the other hand, it is hardly be an exaggeration to say that all poems written by Basho in his mature style are based on this principle. For it was exactly what Basho had in mind when he said that there was a permanent, unchangeable element in all poetry. In any case, crude personification and ingenuous self-dramatization have completely disappeared from his poems, to quote three more. Under the bright moon I walked round and round the lake all night long. Build a fire, my friend, so it will crackle. I will show you something good, a big ball of snow. All the livelong day a lark has sung in the air, yet he seems to have had not quite his fill. In the early autumn of 1687, Basho left on a short trip to the Kashima Shrine. The records of this trip constitute a visit to the Kashima Shrine. Kashima Kiko. The second of the travel sketches translated in this book. Although this is an extremely short work, it is carefully organized with a climax, rather an anti-climax, where Basho beguiles the reader with his own ironic way, falling just where prose ends and poetry begins in the middle of the work. Its somewhat religious atmosphere is due to the fact that it is a kind of tribute to the priest Buko, with whom Basho studied Zen. In its quiet beauty and also in its pseudo-archaic flavor, this work occupies a unique position among the travel sketches by Basho. Almost immediately after he returned home from his trip to the Kashima Shrine, Basho left on the second of his major journeys. This time he stayed on the road for about 11 months, following nearly the same route as he did in the first journey. For the details of his route, see Map 2. This exposition resulted in 2 travel sketches, the records of a travel-worn satchel and a visit to the Sarashima village. The third and fourth of the travel sketches translated in this book. The former covers the first half of the journey from Edo to Suma, and the latter is account of the detour he made to Sarashina village, now part of on his way home. End of section.